Hi guys, welcome to our first video lecture. Um, Last time we talked about functions and what those are in Python, and since they're a little bit of a foreign and complicated concept for some, we're gonna go over them a little more in depth. Um, we're also gonna learn some new things that we didn't learn last time. So here we go. First, let's remember the basics of functions. A function is something that takes in zero or more inputs and then does an operation with those inputs and then spits out an output. You have to define a function and then call it in order to use it. So it's not just enough to write a function because that's just instructions for something. You have to actually use them later. So last time I told you guys the example about feeding an animal. So if I tell you in order to feed my dog, you have to get 2 cups of the dog food that's in my pantry or in my garage or whatever, and then you put it in the dog's bowl, and then you put the bowl on the floor, and then you let the dog eat. Those are the instructions of how to feed my dog, but I haven't actually told you, hey, feed my dog. So then when the time comes, I will be like, hey, can you feed my dog? And then you would already know how to do that because I already gave you the instructions. So then every day after that, I would say, hey, feed my dog, feed my dog, feed my dog, but I wouldn't have to reiterate the instructions all over again. So that's kind of what a function is useful for. And again, the syntax is pretty simple. You would just say def, which stands for define, since you're defining a function. And then the second part would be the name of the function, whatever you want to call it. And then open parentheses, and then whatever arguments or inputs you want to use in your function. And then close parentheses and a colon. So this is how you define it. And then you press enter and then make sure that you tab under here so that it knows these are the instructions, because then once you tab out, then it knows that the function is done. So this function is specifically taking in a Celsius input and it's going to turn it into Fahrenheit. So return our Celsius input times 1.8 plus 32. So that's the operation that it's doing with my input, and then it's returning it. So then now we have to call the function. So in order to do that, we do the name of the function and then whatever input we want to put. So here we want to turn 20 from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So we would say print parentheses Fahrenheit, and then inside the parentheses 20 because that's the number we want to change into Fahrenheit. And then Python would print out whatever that is, like 68 or something, I don't know. Um, you can try that if you want. Okay, so let's see in like an example why functions are useful, because I just told you that it's so that you don't have to repeat something over and over. But let's see what that looks like in actual code. So first, let's start with an example with no function in it. So here I have a list of lists, so like a spreadsheet of people, and the spreadsheet contains name of people, their student status, and their employment status. So then we have 4 people in our list, in our spreadsheet. So we have me, Elia, I'm a PhD candidate, and I'm an instructor. And then we have John, he's a senior, and he works at Starbucks. And then we have Rosa, she's a junior, and she's a TikToker. If you know who that is, let me know. Then we have Luis, he's a master's student, and he works at Microsoft. So now let's say I want to print these these values in like a pretty organized way. So the way I can do that without a function, I would have to say print name, like name colon, and then go into my list and say people from my spreadsheet, go to people and go to the first index, and then within that take 0 because that's the name. And then I would have to do another print statement, and I would have to say student status colon is go to people, go to the first value, and then go to first value or first index within that list, and then go to get my employment status. I would have to go to people, again, the first index, and then the second index, which would be instructor. And then I would have to repeat these 4 lines for every single person in this spreadsheet. So I would have to go in and either copy paste these lines and then change the values inside of the brackets, or just retype it all, which is just annoying, and honestly, it doesn't look good. It would be very confusing if you have like a really long code and then there's suddenly like 30 print statements. That's just ugly. Nobody wants to see that. So let's see how we could do this same thing, but with a function. So here we have a better example with a function. So we define the function def print vals, and then this function is going to take in a name, a student status, and employment. And then we're going to put all of our print statements like we did here, we're going to put them inside of a function. Okay, and this return statement could be gone, doesn't really matter. And then, so our function is now going to print, it knows to print name, then the name, student status, and the student status, employment, and then the employment. So then we define our spreadsheet, the same one as above. And then in order to print all of the values, we would just have to say print vals and then put in our arguments in there. So this already looks a lot more organized and pretty and just less confusing than this thing right here. This just looks like trash. Please don't do that. So this is already good, but still, it's kind of annoying because I still would have to go in and say, call my function every time I want to print a name. But what if I add a name, a person to my spreadsheet? Let's say now I want to add a name here. So I would have, let's see, oh my gosh, I would have, say Nick, and he's a senior also, and he's unemployed. Oh my gosh, I can't type. Unemployed. Okay, so now if I wanted to add someone to my list of lists, then I would have to retype this again, right? I would have to say print vals, people, and then I would have to go in and change 5, 5, and 5 so that it goes to my index 5 of my list, which is Nick, right? So that would work. We could see that. It prints Nick here, but that was just annoying. I had to copy paste, and that's just not very elegant. It's not an elegant code because I would have to go in and manually change every time I add someone. So how could we make this better? We can have another function that goes through our list, and for every list inside my list, it would print the values in a pretty way, like we wanted printed, like this. So let's see what that looks like. So we would have 2 functions, one where we print our values, and then one where we iterate through our list in order to go through every single element in my list and print it. So here we go. This is the same function we had, so I'm not going to explain that one. But then our new function is loop list, because we're going to loop through my list. I put something in here in order to be able to skip the first line of our list, which is just our headers for our columns. Don't worry too much about this. If you ever want to do that, you can do it like this. I'm basically skipping the first item in my list because I don't want to print it in a pretty way, right? So then I would say for list in my list, I want to call my function print vals, which is the function we already have over here, and print or take in the values, the 0th element of my list, the first element of my list, and the second element of my list. So this would equal to name, L0 is name, L1 is student status, and L2 is employment. So this way, whenever we have our list of lists, we're going to go through, we're going to skip the first line because we know it's the headers, and then for every list inside my list, I'm going to call my function print values, and I'm going to print all my values and then go over to the next. So when we run this, we would have Elia, and then my status, and then my employment, and then once this has all been printed, then we would move on to John, and then John would be, we would put the name as our first argument, the student status as second, and then his employment as third, or third input for our function, our other function. So we're kind of using a function inside another function, which is totally okay, and in fact, you should be doing that sometimes if needed. So this is kind of the best way to do this because now let's say, like before, we want to add another person to our spreadsheet. We would no longer have to really do anything other than add the name, obviously the values to my list, but now um, instead of having to rewrite all of this stuff, we wouldn't have to do anything. It's automated. So now Nick is printed, even though we didn't touch anything else other than our list of lists. So that's kind of the best solution for this problem. So this is why functions are so useful, because now I don't have to repeat myself over and over, not only with the print statements, but also with changing the indexes of my list, right? So that's pretty cool. Okay, now we're gonna look a little more into return versus print. So here we have two functions. They're doing the same thing. They're just taking the power of a number. So it's taking a number and then putting it to the power of another number, right? So if we wanted to do 2 squared, x would be 2 and y would be 2. So pretty simple function, not very useful really, but um, it's just for this example. So we have this function and the same function here. The only difference is in the first one, we're printing our result, and in the second one, we're returning our result. Okay, so let's see how that makes it different. So we're going to set a variable, myPow, and we're going to call our function, powerMaker, and then we're going to square 6. So 6 squared, right? And then myPow2, I'm going to call my function, powerMaker2, and then I'm going to cube 6. So 6 cubed, right? Okay, pretty simple. But now let's see what happens when I print this. Print my pow is, and then my pow, and then my pow2 is, and my pow2, which is this, right? So we set variables equal to our results. Okay, so we printed 36 because we called the function, and it says print 36. But then now here it's telling me it's supposed to be printing 36, right? Because I said my POW, and my POW is equal to power maker 62, which is 36. But then my POW2 is printing as 216. So why is this? Because in our first function we use print, and in our second we use return. If we want to be able to save our output into a variable, it's very important that we use return, a return statement, like here, because if not, Python is not going to retain that uh, that value. So it's not going to give you an error. It's not going to, it's going to let you do it, but it's going to be value none. Okay, so if we wanted this to be saved into my variable, my POW, then I would have to have a return statement. And it is okay to have a print statement and then a return statement under it, but it is not okay, remember, to have a print statement under return, because once Python reaches a return statement, it doesn't read anything else under the function. So let's see now if it worked. And it did, because we returned P. So now we are able to save it into my variable, my POW, and so we're able to print it. So that's the importance of the return statement in order to be able to save my outputs from a function into a variable so we can use them later on outside of our code. We won't always want to return things. Like in our example before, we didn't need to return anything because all we wanted to do was be able to print our values in a pretty way, right? So you're not always going to need a return statement. Most of the time, though, I would say you do. Okay, we're going to talk about mutable and immutable objects with respect to functions, right? So we already talked about mutable objects such as lists, and then immutable objects such as strings and numbers. So these behave differently in functions, and we're going to see how. So let's say we have a function that's called list changer that takes in a list and a number as its argument, and then it adds 1 to whatever number we inputted, and then it appends 8 at the end of the list. Okay, that's pretty simple. Now let's say we have a list called A, and it's equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we have a number B, and it's equal to 0. So now we call our function, and we put A and B as our input. So then theoretically what we should get is my number, so B is now equal to 1 because we added 1, and then my list, we appended 8, so it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8. So let's see if that happened. List changer A, B, and then now we're going to print A and B. So, okay, so A, yep, our list is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, but we go to B, which is our number, and it's still 0. So the reason for that is our functions are able to permanently change items or objects that are mutable, such as lists. But when it comes to immutable objects, such as strings and numbers, those changes will only be temporary within our function. So if we were to print num here, then we would see that num was equal to 1 at one point because we added 1 to it. So at one point within our function, it was equal to 1. But then as soon as we were done with the function, the value returned to 0. So it's kind of like the function is its own little world, which is called its own namespace. So within this function, um, the variables that are immutable will change within the function, but then once we're done with it, they'll return to its original value. Let's go a little more into what namespaces are. So in Python, when you call a function, the script pauses and it runs in Python, it gets the output, and then it goes back to your script. So for example, in our first example that we touched on today, we called our function, and then our script went back up here. It looped through our list, and then our script went back up here. It printed, and then again into this function, and it looped to my next list, and then again into the first one, like that. And then once all of this was done, it went back into our script. Let's say we had more code here. Our script would have kept going and done everything after we called our function. Okay, so while Python is going into these functions, it kind of goes into its own little world, meaning that any variables made within those functions will only exist in those functions. Once we're done running that specific iteration of the function, the variables will no longer exist. So let's see what I mean by that. So let's say we have a function called quadratic, and we've done this already a while ago, where we calculate the quadratic equation for our a, b, and c. So first we would calculate the discriminant, and we would say d is equal to b squared minus 4ac, right? And then we would find our two solutions. And then we return a list with our first element being our solution 1, and the second element is our solution 2. So now let's say we call this function and we say solution is equal to quadratic, our function of negative 1, 2, 3. So now a is negative 1, b is 2, and c is 3. Okay, so now we print and we say solution 1 is the first element of our list, and solution 2 is the second element of our list. So let's see if that worked. It did. So the two solutions are 3 and negative 1. Okay, now let's say I want to know what D is, because I want to know what our discriminant was. Let's see what happens when I try to print D. It's going to give me an error, and it's going to say name D is not defined. What do you mean? We defined it in here. But remember, inside our function is a different namespace than outside of our function. So even though we created this variable inside the function, once it's done running, this variable D is going to disappear. So let's say we want to use D later on. We can get around this by saying global D. So now my variable D is a global variable that I can use outside of my function. So let's see now if it lets me. And it does. So just to make sure that it is the right number, I'm going to print D inside of my function to see what it's equal to, and then again outside of my function. So, yep, D was 16 within my function, and D is still 16 outside of my function, but only because I said global D. So if I want to have a variable, if I want to create a variable in my function that I want to later use outside of my function, I need to make it a global variable by saying keyword global D, or whatever variable you want to make. So that's it for this lecture. Thank you guys for tuning in and for watching this before our class on Monday. I hope this was helpful and I hope it makes it easier to follow along without the distractions of as many questions while we're just learning the basics. And now during class time, we'll have more time to do examples, more classwork, and ask more questions. So yeah, thank you.